Bruce.
Hello. So, how's it going, party people? It's always a toss-up when somebody reads my bio, whether they're actually going to say the name of my podcast, and the motherfucker in the cape. I never know, and it's always kind of the exciting part. Like I'll be like, are they going to say it or they're not going to say it? In fact, that's the only thing that they didn't list on my Regis faculty profile. They were just like, he hosts a popular podcast, and that was it. Anyway, so I want to thank Natalia for introducing me, and thank you guys for having me. I write a weekly comic for the Colorado Sun that deals with sort of local politics and stuff like that. I don't know if you guys know the Colorado Sun, but it's free. It's basically reporters from the Denver Post started their own paper because the Post was having problems. Anyway, so listen, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we can have some discussion. You guys can put your questions in the chat while I'm talking, and at the end, I'll try and answer as many as I can. So I was thinking about this sort of rise of Afrofuturism presently, and it made me think about this. I'm about to take you on the super geeky deep dive. Okay, so in the 60s, they had this comic book called Superboy, which was the adventures of Superman as a boy. And out of that comic book grew, he connected with some superheroes in the future who were in the 25th century. They were called the Legion of Superheroes. So they're all like teenage superheroes from the 25th century, and they all sort of worshipped the legacy of Superboy. That book has been published on and off. It's still being published, actually. So, but around the 70s, somebody wrote in and said, hey, DC Comics, how come there are no black people in the future? The editor at the time was apparently not a fan of that question, but after that pressure from a few different places, his explanation was that all the black people in the future self-segregated to a magical island that only appears every 100 years. And I tell you this story to tell you like the lengths that people have gone to write black people out of the future, out of the visions of the future, whether it's comics, movies, television, whatever it is. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of BIPOC people, so when I look at how much effort has been put into sort of writing us out of this future, it's an interesting thing to try to engage in it. I'll give you one more example. In the 80s, there was He-Man and Masters of the Universe. They were sort of futuristic from some distant planet. And, I was into them. And my father saw that there were no black characters in the whole line. And somehow he found this alternative toy line without the internet. This is the 80s, called Sunman. And it had black, Latinx characters, Asian characters, and they were built just like the He-Man characters. So I still have Sunman. No, he's not around here right now. I would have showed him to you. Anyway, all right. So I'm gonna tell you the story. When I was 23 years old and I still lived in Atlanta, I was driving home from the movies one night. I had a Cadillac Cimarron, and I actually turned on the fog lights instead of the headlights. The switches were right next to each other. So I drove about 50 feet, then I realized it, and I turned on the headlights. Still, a cop pulled me over, sirens, flashing lights, the whole thing. Have you been drinking, sir? Now I want to take a step back before I finish this story. When I was 5, my father made the mistake of leaving me with my troubled uncle, right? He was the one who knocked out my cousin's fiance at their wedding. Anyway, I'm sure my dad thought it was okay to leave me with his younger brother while he ran to the store. But in that short span of time, my uncle gave me a can of beer. I remember I was 5. I hated it. I hated the taste of alcohol. That was the last time that I finished an alcoholic drink. And I still really hate the taste of alcohol. So I just never really got into drinking. And any one of you who's thinking, you just haven't had the right drink, shut up. When I tell people I don't like onions, no one's like, you just got to mix it with something sweet. But for some reason, when it comes to alcohol, everybody has a solution for me. Anyway, this cop, he asked if I'd been drinking, and I answered honestly. I said, oh, no, I don't drink. I just hit the wrong switch, the one for the fog. And before I could finish, the cop was yelling at me. Why? Apparently because I said I didn't drink. Now, here I could go into more detail about this terrible interaction I had as a young man with a police officer, but that's not really what I'm here for. One of my heroes, this brilliant Black artist named Melvin Van Peebles, he gave an interview in France in the 1960s. He said that although he was an American and had published half a dozen novels in France, he'd never tried to publish any in America. The reporter asked why. Melvin said because he felt like the only thing publishers in America wanted him to write about was Black suffering. And it sort of makes me think of these media interviews where people want to skip over my writing to try to make my trauma into the story. Like, can you tell us about when you dealt with police brutality, or how has racism scarred you? Basically, they're saying, hey, Black dude, can you parade your pain for all of us to see? But nah. I'm not going into the excruciating ritual of bearing my soul in order to convince someone that racism exists. All that would do is hurt me. It won't convince someone who denies it. There's enough videos, books, movies, blogs, documentaries, graphic novels, songs, really whatever media you want to consume, there's enough proof. So sure, I address race and social justice in my writing. So let's talk about my writing. You know, when you want to discuss police reform, you need to talk to someone who's actually qualified, not just me because I'm Black. Call a community activist or a policy expert. How ridiculous is it to be like, let's hear what this local comic book guy says about fixing the government. He is Black after all. Anyway, so why did I bring that cop up? It's because that dude couldn't see me. It didn't matter that I've never been drunk in my life. All he saw was a named African-American suspect who committed the heinous crime of driving 50 feet with my headlights off. I wasn't a human to him. I wasn't a person. One of my best friends growing up, another Black dude from Atlanta, we used to rap together. And he was always sort of a dick, but he's a cop now. He's a detective. And he and I have been able to kind of talk about some of his perspective being a Black cop in the South. So I know that someone becoming a police officer doesn't make them necessarily have to be the way that this police officer was with me. There's this thing that I've been saying, all the isms in the world, racism, sexism, classism, ageism, whatever, they all come from either a refusal or a failure to see the humanity of another person. Now, if it's a refusal, then that person has already made a decision and I'm not really worried about reaching them. But if it's simply a failure, then art is a powerful way to reach them, to allow them to experience the humanity of people that are different from them. Now, here we are in the midst of the most major world changes of any of our lives. pandemics, protests, the world shut down. I was talking with a white journalist friend who told me about his colleagues, other journalists, who were covering last summer's protest around the world. They would show up and identify themselves as journalists to the police. Some of them still got pepper sprayed or shot by rubber bullets or beaten or arrested for doing nothing illegal. And my friend said, if police are doing this to us in front of the cameras, what have they been doing to Black people all these years when the cameras were off? And then he said, Black people were right, which cracked me up. And while the world feels like it's crumbling to pieces, here we are in this education world, some of us artists, some of us just wanting to create something. And sometimes that can all seem silly. And especially for me, writing comic books and graphic novels while secret police were snatching people off the streets of Portland. The whole sentence seems like it's something made up. But it can seem really silly, even selfish, to be creating art right now. Like, should I be doing this right now, or should I just concentrate on marching out in these streets, giving my time to social justice nonprofits, pushing for new legislation? And I mentioned this in the TED talk I gave, but in 1894, Russian author Leo Tolstoy wrote a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And it was an interpretation of Christian doctrine that advocated for nonviolence, even in the face of war. It was actually banned in Russia, so he had to publish it in Germany. He spent a few decades thinking about it, and this book was the culmination of his ideology. Now, in the 1920s, Mahatma Gandhi wrote something called The Story of My Experiments with Truth, which is a trippy name, but I dig it. The Story of My Experiments with Truth. In it, he said that Tolstoy's book was one of the three most important influences of his life. So Tolstoy's book was one of the three most important influences in the life of Mahatma Gandhi. So a guy wrote a book which was banned in his own country. Then years later, that book inspired a leader of the Indian independence from British rule. So I'm saying some dude in Russia had an idea, he wrote it down. His book helped inspire one of the most famous activists in history. So I ask you, what if Tolstoy had never written that book? What if he thought, man, it's silly for me to be writing. I need to be out here doing things that actually change the world. So marching, protests, legislation, those are things that change the world. And so is art. Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by Gandhi. So how would the civil rights movement in America be different if Tolstoy had never written his book? Tolstoy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. And I'm talking about the importance of art to talk about the importance of seeing ourselves in art, right? So, well, some of you might have heard this story. Do you remember the original Star Trek series from the 60s? There was one Black cast member, Nichelle Nichols. She played the character Uhura. Now, before the show, she had a career doing musical theater and Broadway shows. At their height, a lot of the cast from Star Trek released musical albums. Most of them were ridiculous in the best ways, especially Shatner's. But Nichelle Nichols was the only cast member who released albums that were seriously good, because that was her background. So think about it. She'd been doing these Broadway shows where she got to play these fully realized characters with different viewpoints, varied backgrounds. She got to sing, she got to dance, she got to really enjoy her craft. Then she left all of that to be on a television show where every episode her lines were pretty much, "I'm hailing them now, Captain." After a couple of years of that, she was bored and unfulfilled. Wouldn't you be? So she went and told the creator of the show, Gene Roddenberry, that she wasn't returning for the next season. She wanted to go back to theater because it was more artistically fulfilling. Of course, he tried to convince her otherwise, but to no avail. A few weeks later, Nichelle Nichols was at this banquet, and there she met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She was surprised because one of his people came over and told her that he wanted to meet her. When they talked, he told her that he loved her on Star Trek. She thanked him and told him that she was planning on leaving. So what did this legendary leader of the civil rights movement say to that? He basically said, nah, you can't do that. We need you. Nichelle Nichols was confused. Martin Luther King told her that seeing her play this vision of a Black woman in the future was inspiring to him, his children, and everyone who watched her on TV every week. Moved by his words, Nichelle Nichols decided to stay on the show. Decades later, the astronaut Mae Jemison, also a Black woman, said she was inspired to become an astronaut by seeing Nichelle Nichols. And she wasn't the only one. So here's a practical example where somebody created art that gave an inclusive vision of the future that inspired at least one Black woman specifically to become an astronaut. Then on that original series, there was an Asian character, a Russian character. It was a powerful vision of the future. Anyway, so what do Tolstoy and Star Trek have to do with what I'm saying to you? Good question. Check my notes. Okay, so Star Trek began in the mind of a writer, Gene Roddenberry. He imagined a future without racism, without poverty, and without class. He imagined future technologies, some of which inspired technology that we have now. When people were designing the flip phone, that was definitely based off Star Trek. His vision wasn't perfect. The uniforms he gave his female characters were questionable at best. But he wrote that story of his vision with the future along with other writers. He created art that actors, directors, and musicians came along to add their own art to. Then that art inspired Martin Luther King Jr. It inspired a new generation of astronauts and inspired technology. It also inspired some mediocre movies. But more importantly, his art created changes in society. So what if Tolstoy and Gene Roddenberry had decided that their writing was silly, vapid, vain, in the midst of the world's problems? What would the world have lost? If Tolstoy hadn't inspired Gandhi, who inspired Martin Luther King, would I even be speaking to you now? Would I be here? If we're not writing visions of the future that include as many different people as possible, then the people who don't want that vision will either prevent it from happening or write something crazy like an island that appears every 100 years. There's a superhero that's from that island. He eventually made his way into the Legion of Superheroes. He's terrible. His name's Tyrock. And the artist at the time was a comic guy, artist named Mike Grell. And he hated the idea so much that he purposely gave Tyrock the worst costume he could think of. So he gave him like Elvis collar with short shorts. And like you can Google Tyrock, it's Tyroc, and it is a travesty. But yeah, but that is the result of somebody who did not want to create an inclusive vision being forced to, you know. Anyway, I want you to think about, in the midst of the world's problems, what will the world lose if you decide not to create whatever's in your heart? So here's what I have to tell you. Art is not silly. Art is vital. Art is the fuel for revolution. Art takes the intangible and makes it into something we can wrestle with. I'm gonna say it again. Art takes the intangible and makes it into something we can wrestle with. When you think about whatever your favorite song is, it's almost always a song that expressed some emotion that you didn't have the words for. Whether it's love or awkwardness or something about frustrations at a job, it's because that song took something that was intangible for you and made it into something that you had a vocabulary for, and suddenly you could wrestle with it. So, before the word microaggressions existed, we had no way to identify what was happening. But now that the word is here, I can point it out. I can even bond with someone else who's experienced it. That's what art does. It takes the shadowy rot of oppression and it shines a light on it, reveals its shapes. It allows us to build communities around destroying oppression. Think of how often protesters sing freedom songs together, or how the leaders of social movements will tell you about a book that they read that changed their thinking and made it possible for them to do everything they're doing. That is the power of art. Remember, Martin Luther King drew inspiration from Star Trek. Gandhi drew inspiration from Tolstoy. Every revolution needs art. So whatever you create, books, paintings, photography, poetry, plays, movies, sculpture, whatever it is, you have the chance in your work to communicate the humanity of someone to your reader, to your viewer, to your patron. What if on the night before he stopped me, that cop had read something that connected him to the humanity of Black people? How might our interaction have been different? Don't let this world scare you. You're feeling anxiety about sharing your work with the world. Nazis and white nationalists are having no problem speaking up. They're Zoom bombing, they're marching, they're swatting, they're doxing, they're joining police departments and running for political office. And we're afraid to put our messages out into the world. I've said it before, but it's okay to feel afraid. Just don't let that stop you. If there was ever a time that the world needed to hear from you, to hear what you have to say, that time's now. Thank you for your time and attention. Okay, we have some questions. I know that was an abrupt transition.
We're getting a lot of responses in the chat that what your message is saying is hitting home. One of the questions that I had for myself, I'm having trouble. I don't have a problem like presenting my work. I have a problem with it being accepted. The avenues that I'm going, I'm getting shut down. It's more like predominantly white. There's only I'm a writer. There's only one predominant publishing company. I'm sure there's more, but there's one dominant one that's Black owned. The rest are,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that's a real question. Okay, so when I first put out my first graphic novel, Burning Metronome, I self-published it, and it led to all these crazy and wonderful things. But one of them was that a literary agent reached out to me. He called me, and he was interested in representing me because I dealt with social issues in the book. So he called me. I had no idea who he was, and so I Googled him. Turned out he was Barack Obama's agent, Susie Orman, Russell Simmons, like crazy, right? Like a crazy list of people. I'm his only non-famous client, right? Uh, so the reason I say that is because I want you to understand sort of where he's positioned in the industry, right? Like, I don't think I could have a more powerful literary agent. And yet, he's having difficulty placing my book with publishers. So I look at like, say like a white fantasy writer, right? Who may not have even finished their first book and they get multi-book deals, right? And then I look at me who generates my own press, uh, has finished multiple books of my own, uh, speaks, teaches, you know, all this kind of stuff, right? And they're like, I'm not sure about this, right? And it takes me back to that Melvin Van Peebles thing of the quote that I mentioned earlier, where he was talking about publishers being focused on Black pain, right? So if I wrote a book called All the Ways That White People Have Been Mean to Me, that would be published right now. But me being a graphic novelist who deals with fantasy and sci-fi, it's like too much because in their minds, Black is a genre, right? Which is ridiculous. So all I got to tell you, Natalia, is I got to the point where I just felt like I'm going to Master P these fools. And so to make that reference more accessible to everyone, Master P was a rapper from the 90s who sold his music out of his trunk for years and built his riches, you know, off of that. And so by the time the major labels wanted to take interest in him, he didn't need them, so he can negotiate a better deal. And so my agent can continue to do what he's doing. He can continue to push, but I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep putting out stuff. I'm going to keep expanding. I'm going to keep making my connections with people. And if they never recognize me, I mean, if I was waiting on them to recognize me, y'all wouldn't be talking to me now, you know? So I think having that determination, as I said, Melvin Van Peebles was very inspiring to me. There's a documentary on Amazon Prime about him called How to Eat Your Watermelon in White Company and Enjoy It. And it is such a story of determination. Like, I'll just give you just a little bit just so that you kind of know what I'm talking about. Like, he put out a book when I think when he was in his late 20s, and he wanted to make film, and nobody would support him making film. He heard a rumor that in France, if you publish 4 novels, you automatically get the licenses and everything to make a film. So he moved to France, learned French, wrote on the staff of a magazine, wrote several novels, then started making films. That's just the beginning of a story. But I'm saying that level of determination, when it comes to that, like, you might not have all the opportunities that everybody has, but certainly nobody's going to out hustle you, you know?
Thank you for that. In the chat, it says, this message speaks to me on so many levels. Thank you so much for articulating it in so powerful a way. I have a question, observation, whatever you want to call it. How can creators who create for others find motivation, inspiration to keep going? I've spent most of my career as a digital artist,
Mm.
realizing the visions of others, many times devoid of meaning at best or outright harmful at worst.
Uh, Thank you for that question. That's a big one, right? So my first job out of college was producing a TV show for a televangelist, and that was I actually grew up in that church, so I knew the pastor, but that was the actual worst job I've ever had. And part of it was I would, like doing television production was artistic, but they would have all these terrible ideas. And in my heart, I'd be like, you're destroying my art, you know, but of course they're paying me for it. So that's, you know, so, you know, you get to a point where you have to decide that you're going to do a thing and nothing's going to stop you, even if you'd work on it 1 hour a week, because I know so many comic book artists who want to like make it or who want to make a comic. They're friends of mine, and if every artist who asked me to write something had drawn what they asked me to write, I would have 12 graphic novels instead of the 2 that I have out right now. And so, like, there's this thing of overcoming ourselves in order to get things done. Stephen King has this kind of hard quote, but it's right. He says, amateurs wait for inspiration while the rest of us just get up and go to work. Now, I have a quote about inspiration, which I'm gonna hit you with. My quote is, inspiration makes a great kindling, but a terrible fuel. So you can spark a flame with it, but it cannot carry you through. Finishing an artistic project is work. It's work. It's work. It is work. And if you're waiting for inspiration, then you're never going to be able to make a living at your art. You're certainly most likely never going to finish anything because inspiration is fleeting by nature. So the idea can be inspired, but finishing it is work. So when you're inspired, write down the idea, but then make a plan. What's between here? What's between this point and this point? What's between where I am right now and this thing being finished? And what are all the steps in between? And then just start working on those steps. That's the real thing. That's really it. It's work. And a lot of creative people are caught up on the idea of just feeling inspired because that's what made us want to be creative. But it's not enough. You have to put some work to it. All right, who else has a question?
This person says, what exercises or practices do you do to keep your energy, creativity, passion going?
Well, before the world got poisonous, I used to go dancing 3 times a week because that was very cathartic to my soul, But I'll say once you recognize that creativity is work, then it's a lot easier to get your head out of your ass about it, right? Like there are things that we do that we sabotage ourselves with. For example, we compare our first work to whoever our favorite artist was at their prime, right? So let's say Toni Morrison or Hemingway are your favorite writers, right? So you want to write one thing and you want to be as good as they were at their prime. But the first thing that they wrote was probably not as good. And I'm not even talking about the first thing that was published. I'm talking about the first thing that was written by them that we probably never got to see. It is unfair. And then also, even with our favorite artists, they usually put out something that we did not like as much, but we don't compare ourselves to that. We just try to compare ourselves to them at their prime and try to force ourselves to hit that in our first step. So, I know this is sort of an indirect answer to the question. The answer, I guess, basically is stop sabotaging ourselves. It's okay to feel the imposter syndrome or whatever, but just don't listen to it. Like fear doesn't get to make our decisions for us. You guys know that expression, caught like a deer in headlights? That is fear. That does not make the deer safer. When the deer freezes in the road, that actually puts them in more danger. So if you're letting fear make your decisions, it's not the way to win. Beyond that, it's really about making a plan. Like I was saying, like figure out the steps between here and there and just work on a little bit every day, or every week or whatever. Um, yeah. And then I guess figure out what things inspire you, right? Like, so if there's a certain kind of music that inspires you, or if there are books or a movie, just check in with those things and take all that inspirational energy. You know, some people running inspires them. I like dancing because my mind is shut off and I'm just, doing my Michael Jackson spins or whatever, right? But like sometimes on the dance floor, there'll be something I was trying to solve in the story that pops up and I'm like, and I'll step to the side and put it in my phone and then go back to the dance floor, you know? So like find the things that feed you. All right, what other questions are there?
What is your workflow for approaching collaboration?
Oh, uh, so I've definitely done a lot of collaboration as a comic book writer. Uh, it varies with the artist. Because for as much, okay, so specifically with comics, comics are hard. Like drawing them is really hard. It is doing like 100 tiny illustrations for a single chapter, right? It's very labor intensive. So whatever insecurity that the other types of artists have, comic book artists have that, plus the fact that they're on like trying to overcome a mountain of labor, right? So more of them don't finish than do. So what I try to do is I ask an artist what kind of stuff they want to draw, like what do they like to draw, because what I'm most interested in as a writer is the human conflict. So if they like drawing space or the ocean or the woods or elves or whatever it is, I can find a human conflict within that and I can write that. And it actually makes for better collaborations. But then I found also certain artists are freaked out in one area, like paralyzed with fear, but in another area they're not, right? So there's a comic artist who will never finish a comic. Like you can give him a script a year ahead of time, but he won't finish it till the night before Denver Comic Con because for the rest of his life he can be like, I only had 3 hours to finish it, you know. So he's not reliable for comics, but he's reliable for logos. He's one of the best logo designers I know. And so since I know that he's paralyzed in this one area, I only reach out to him for the other area. There's another guy who won't finish one for much of the same reasons, won't finish comics, but can do like layouts, like the rough sketches and all the camera angles and stuff like that. So I hire him for that. There's just so many examples of that. But I guess specifically when it comes to collaboration, I'm trying to find what the artist's strengths are and passions are. And then as we get to work on things, sometimes some strengths become more clear. So like some artists are really good at drawing action scenes, but not as good with the emotional scenes. So when it comes to the emotional scenes for that artist, I write a lot more explicitly what I'm envisioning. And when it comes to action scenes, I just let them do what they do because they got it. With my weekly comic, the artist Corey Redford, she's really great at so when we first started, I would always write the location and kind of like I would give visual references for what the characters were doing. We've been working together for a couple of years now. And in that time I've learned, oh, if she gets to pick the location, it's way more beautiful. Like she goes out and does photography, places around Denver, and does some really cool stuff. So now I'm just like, wherever you want it to be. And the only time I specify location is if it is specific to the story that I'm telling in that moment. But it's a relationship, right? You're just learning how to go. So these are obviously collaborations like where we sort of co-own something. If I'm hiring somebody, it's a little different. It's more about looking at what they've done before and trying to figure out whether they can do what I need and whether they can hit their deadlines, which most people can't.
Thank you so much for that. Um, Would you say that you do collaboration that's interdisciplinary? Have you considered that? Maybe working with a mathematician?
Um, no, I haven't thought about that. But I have, I've certainly done different types of writing. So I wrote one of my childhood friends is actually the televangelist that I mentioned that I worked for, one of my friends who worked for them. Uh, After I did that job, I was like, never again television. I left. And then he stayed in television and movies and won an Emmy and stuff. So he's a director in Atlanta. And he asked me to write a script for a feature film. And so I did. And we were supposed to film that in September. So that's gonna be different for me because it'll be way more people realizing the vision that I had initially. Like, because once I've written it, it's out of my hands. You know, like there's the director's interpretation, there's the actor's interpretation. Um, we have a couple women who are helping produce it, and they're like identifying locations, and whoever's doing like the set dressing, they read a part of it and they have their interpretation. So it sort of becomes collective a collective manifestation of the vision that I had at the beginning. And I'm really interested in seeing how that goes. I don't know if that answered the question. Did it?
It did. Thank you so much. Um,
Right on.
One of our audience members wanted to ask, why do you think some people lose their insecurities and perform their best when working with others, but when they're working alone, they struggle with self conflict?
Oh, that's a good question. I, I think it's the irrationality of fear, right? So like, um, if you do it by yourself, at the end, when people criticize it, they're criticizing your soul, your baby, you know. But if you're coming in behind somebody else and you're fulfilling their vision, then you're like, well, I did this part of it, but it's not really my thing. So, and it's easier to sort of disassociate yourself from it. Uh, Fear is a real thing. I feel like most of how people talk about creative fear is to ignore it or to like push it aside. But you can't really do that. You have to manage it. You have to make a choice. Hey, this fear is here, but it doesn't get to make my decisions. That's different than saying just take some deep breaths and the fear will go away, right? Uh, and if you let fear run you, I think about Emily Dickinson, right? Like how her poems were discovered after she died. I think that's the right person. Now I'm doubting myself, but okay, you guys are nodding. We're just gonna go with it. So, what if nobody ever discovered them, right? Because she in her life never got to enjoy people's reaction to what she had written, which is a tragedy to me, you know? And I know so many talented artists, and I just think about the fact that they can't get over their fear and the world would never be able to see what it is that they're creating. That is a travesty. And I really think when it comes down to it, if any of us who love any kind of creativity for any reason, we have opinions on it. So it means that we also have some art that we hate. We don't have to name any names, but I'm just saying we have some where we're like, this is garbage, right? But the people who make the garbage that we're thinking, they're putting their stuff out. So I'm like, okay, if this garbage man can put his stuff out and not be ashamed of it, then why am I being so afraid? You know, like fear really does not serve any purpose in creativity. It is, it's, it's oppressive. It is paralyzing. And it's okay that you have it. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling the fear, but you get to decide whether or not that fear makes your choices for you. And it shouldn't. I should mention me and the filmmaker friend are working on an educational video for how to overcome creative fear, which I think will be ready in a couple of months, like specific strategies and stuff like that. But I think once you admit that it's a real thing that you have to manage, then you're already steps ahead, because you can't just shake it off. You can't just ignore it. It's there. Fear is real, but what it's telling you usually isn't real.
Thank you. We're going to have one last question,
Cool.
and then we're coming to the close and have to kind of depart and go our separate ways artistically.
Right.
Audience member wants to know where can I get notified when the film is released? I'd love to watch and share that with my students.
Thanks. So the overcoming fear video, that I'll be updating that on my my website. So that's just Allen with the W.com, and Allen with one L, 4 letters, more better. I once got, when I was a kid, there was this rapper, the real Roxanne, and I had a super big crush on her, and I went and got her autograph, and I told her how to spell my name, and she still spelled it with 2 L's. Anyway, so yeah, I'll be putting updates there and on social media and stuff like that. And as far as the feature film, same thing. We're filming it in September, and I'll be putting updates. Me and the director friend did a YouTube series right at the beginning of the pandemic called Making Our First Movie, where we kind of started putting things together and stuff like that. I'm just gonna put it in the chat to make it easy. Boom, boom, boom. I'm not really good at multitasking, which is why it's been great that Natalia has been helping me with the chat while I'm talking. But this one I'm doing. All right. Was that the last question, or was okay? Hey, okay. Well, I appreciate all of you being here, listening to me, asking questions, being engaged. I really appreciate it. So thank you. The silent claps.
You're amazing. Thank you so much for coming. If you have any other questions that weren't answered here, send your questions to CII at ucdenver.edu, and we will give them directly over to Mr. Brooks and get your response to you. Thank you all for coming. If you were here for extra credit and you didn't check in, please drop your name in the chat and I will get it over to your professor. Thank you for attending another CII joint. That's what I'm going to call it. No, just kidding. But Friday we have Susie Q. Smith at 4 o'clock. The flyer is on our social media as well as our in our newsletter and on our website. So please come and attend that as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Just wanted to make sure I got credit. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, the rejection, I may contact him, as a comedian. And the rejection I got, well, I could talk about that, and the risk taking and the fear. In fact, if you're not a little anxious, you're doing something wrong. So, but yeah, it's personal. I'd like to think, hey, it's subjective and they have no vision. And when I do auditions or